Kia ora. Colleagues, government of Cook Islands and distinguished guests, it's really great to be here with so many amazing and diverse farmer organisations here in Rarotonga. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to give a bit of an overview before we launch into the panel. My name's Tony Jansen. I've had a long involvement with farmer organisations in the Pacific. I was co-founder of Custom Garden Association in the Solomons with the late Johnny Tutua, where we've done a lot of work on these issues around food security. I was involved in the Solomons for many years, working in a lot of remote areas. I took part with KGA, as they're called, through the kind of ethnic tension period when the government basically disappeared, and the role of people's organisations was critically important in delivering services. I was involved in then looking at how could, all that effort that went into one small organisation that had a positive impact but still had fairly limited reach, how could you do more? And from there, I got involved in working with other farmer organisations. We connected with Johnny Tutua as well into Bougainville, where we worked in the post-UN peace process there with some amazing farmer organisations that had grown up in what they called the Bougainville crisis, and later extended into Southern Highlands in PNG, where we worked with an NGO that at that point was serving 350,000 people that had no government functioning at all in that part of PNG at the time, during a crisis that was going on there that was kind of little recognised. And since then, I was involved in establishing a network called the Melanesia Farmer First Network, which was kind of a precursor to, and I have to keep reminding myself, Pacific Farmers Organisation. I think we're all used to calling it PFON, but that was an initial network that connected organisations in Solomons, Vanuatu, PNG, and a little bit into Fiji. And I think Pacific Farmers kind of picked up the baton and has grown so much, but has really carried on that work. And in the interim, I spent quite a bit of time in West Africa, also in Senegal. Actually, I'm interested to pick up that conversation about millet mills in Senegal. But I worked in Senegal and Gambia, also with farmer organisations, and it surprised me how much was similar, but also how much more organised farmers are. And when we talk about civil society, yes, we need civil society and civil society dialogue and platforms, but we actually need specific space for farmer organisations and the specific needs of agriculture. And so there's a lot of potential to do more there. I guess that's by way of introduction. And I'm a really passionate believer in farmer organisations driving local level initiatives. So when we talk about climate change in the Pacific, I think Kyle mentioned quite a few of those coming impacts, of increased intensity of extreme weather events, coral bleaching, the impacts on the oceans will have quite huge impacts on livelihoods, the possibility of more health problems, the spread of malaria, the displacement, the loss of biodiversity that's critical for Pacific livelihoods. Those are all things that are coming. And I think we know, the world set a target of 1.5 degrees to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I think the wording of that, the Paris Agreement, was to avert catastrophic climate change. And that was where that number came from. And I think it's pretty clear that the world is not going to reach that target, that we're going to warm even more than that, and that we are looking at probably catastrophic climate change. In the Pacific, I think for the world, really, it is the greatest challenge of our time. And for the Pacific, they face particular challenges because they already were challenged, with remoteness, with a lot of issues that have to do with how the Pacific Islands are, which are also their strength. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. But I think one of the things when I was thinking about this, we're talking about adaptation to climate change, and there's an enormous amount of money and resources that is being made available to support adaptation. But I think we also just have to remind ourselves that the reason why adaptation is being resourced and supported is because we're not doing anything much about climate change. And it reminded me in a lot of the value chain work in the Pacific. I've done some work on cocoa and coconuts and things like that. And the Pacific is a price taker. It's not a price setter. It's not a big enough producer to influence global markets. And so the Pacific always has to deal with these upheavals. The cocoa price depends on what happens in West Africa, and livelihoods either go up or down in the Pacific based on those global markets. And I was thinking in many ways with the carbon and the climate change, it's the same thing. The Pacific is not a carbon setter. The Pacific is a carbon taker. And if you look at the footprint of Pacific Islanders and how much carbon they produce, it's just nothing. The average Pacific Islander produces less than half a ton of carbon per year, whereas the average Australian, I'm Australian, or American produces 18 tons per year. And really, that's where the problem is, and that's where the action is needed to slow down climate change. But in the Pacific, for us as farmer organizations, it will be about adaptation. There's no choice but to adapt to that reality. And so this, I'll just quickly mention. So I think in that adaptation, there's two things to look at, and a few people have mentioned that. It's about food systems, and food production and reliance and the reliability of food systems to respond to increasing shocks. And it's also about the economic relationships, of how the Pacific is connected really to food systems in other parts of the world. And this is where climate change becomes even more complex and challenging, because the Pacific is now dependent on rice, wheat, poultry feed, all kinds of inputs that are produced in other farming systems that are also facing pressure from climate change. And so that vulnerability to that economic connectedness is the other aspect. And so in my talk today, Kyle talked about grassroots organizations, but I'm really homing in and I'm talking about farmer organizations. There are many types of grassroots organizations, but farmer organizations play a critical role in this space. So that figure came up this morning. Sorry, you can't read that. I'll read it out for you. The subtext, but 70% of Pacific Islanders rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. And most of them, I think the figure was 95%, are small farmers. And that's actually a similar proportion globally, that people don't realize, that small farmers produce most of the world's food for most of the world's population. And so they're key players when we want to talk about food security and climate change adaptation. That's already been covered. I just thought I'd add in a few other facts that I think probably many of you in the room know, but often people outside the Pacific don't know. And that's that the Pacific is a cradle of agriculture. A lot of people outside the Pacific like to think that, oh, isn't that, people by the beach going fishing or something like that? And they don't realize how important agriculture is. It's very central to the Pacific way of life. And actually, taro was domesticated in the PNG highlands 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, at the same time as wheat was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. And so the Pacific is the cradle, a co-cradle of agriculture. And there's some evidence that galep or nali nut, the ngai nut, which is really common in Melanesia through to Fiji, I think, is the world's oldest domesticated crop. There are sites that are 20,000 years old in PNG, and so agriculture is ancient. The Pacific is responsible. It's a center of origin, which means the genetic biodiversity comes from the Pacific for yams, taro, sugarcane, bananas, and a number of those crops have hugely contributed to global food security, and that's coming from the Pacific. And so the Pacific has benefited from other flows, but just to remind that. And so what do farmer organizations already do? My text's probably a bit small there, but they work on helping farmers to improve productivity. They work on diversification, access to new varieties, whether that's for food crops or for cash crops, getting access to planting materials to seize on opportunities. They work on the issues around nutrition and agriculture. That's a big theme in the Pacific, where there's huge problem with non-communicable disease and how to support, how can agriculture, Pacific Islanders didn't have those problems. Those problems have come from attitudes towards food and increasing consumption of processed imported foods. And so the answer is kind of there to solve what really is a nutrition crisis. Many of the and this is the work that Pacific Farmer members are doing that I'm talking about here. A lot of work on value chains, on facilitating market connections, on enabling access to markets and fair prices, organizing and connecting farmers, introducing new technologies, testing technologies with farmers, raising awareness, consulting farmers, providing a voice for farmers in policy and dialogue with government. And more recently, quite a few of the members are also working on disaster response or crisis response. And I think we saw that through the pandemic, but also in other disasters. And the Pacific is very disaster prone, and there's been a number of really large, significant disasters over the last few years, and that's likely to increase. The farmer organizations are an obvious partner to be involved in that. And so what does climate adaptation look like in the Pacific? Well, it's kind of a combination of approaches that need to be tailored to the specific context and needs of each location. And so there's a whole bunch of things up there. They're all around resilience, around preparing for shocks, and around kind of hedging bets, not putting all your eggs in one basket. And so things like, and this is very similar, and that's kind of intentional to the previous list, crop diversification, more resilient farming methods, looking at managing pest and disease, soil fertility, rainwater harvesting and irrigation and water management and catchment management, access to climate and seasonal weather information, conservation of ecosystems that are critical for resilience and also for agriculture, the disaster preparedness and risk reduction, capacity building and training, market diversification and resilient access to markets, community-based approaches, and financial services and insurance, something that has not been so much in the Pacific, but there are really interesting opportunities to look at, like index-based insurance and tools like that to help farmers reduce their risk and exposure to disasters. And so all of that is work that needs resources. It's all things that farmer organizations in the Pacific are actually quite well placed to do to a limited scale, but they're in a very good position to do that kind of work. But the next slide, this is from an IFAD study that was done in 2020. This is the percentage of global climate funding that reaches small farmers globally, 1.7%. And couldn't find a figure for the Pacific, but I think we probably all know who are involved in this space that it's going to be quite similar. But yet, if we look at all those other aspects, it's very clear that farmers have to be part of these solutions, and it's very clear that farmers' organizations will be the ideal mobilizers of that process. So this is a big problem, and you try and think about, okay, well, why is that the case? And I won't try and go through all of this. I think Kyle had some nicer graphic diagrams, but I kind of just put the farmers and the communities down the bottom there, and all those actors, those institutions up above, are all trying to reach farmers and communities in different ways. That their adaptation efforts that this climate financing is about really cannot succeed if they don't get technologies and information and different actions happening at the community level. But if we look at it, it's just so complex. There's donors with climate finance, there's other donor priorities, there's governments, ministries of agriculture. A lot of climate finance goes through ministries of environment, and which there can, depending on the country, there can be other kinds of disconnects there with agriculture. There's multilateral agencies, UN agencies, national and regional research institutions, international NGOs, including humanitarian response organizations, local NGOs. And then on the market side, we have a kind of similar complexity. If we want to talk about more resilient markets of traders, exporters, finance suppliers, and you just kind of look at that and you go, okay, well, how do you navigate that? What's the pathways through that? And there are pathways through that, and there are examples of success, but unfortunately not very many. And you look at these farmer organizations down the bottom, and how are they going to get through all of that? Or how is that climate finance in their name, going to actually get down to them and help the Pacific to adapt to this massive problem that's coming that farmers need to be part of? And I think when you think about that, and that's why I put in the regional umbrella of farmer organizations, which is what Pacific Farmers is, it's not going to be possible for all those farmer organizations to be able to navigate that. They have different strengths, and they can do things with their farmers, with their communities, but we need something in the middle. And I think that's where Pacific Farmers Organization is and can play a critical role. And there will be need for more intermediaries like that to build those bridges, to allow that climate finance to reach the people that it needs to. So just my last slide, what's needed to get there, and I'm sure this will be discussed more by the panel, but we need stronger farmer organizations, we need capacity building of those organizations, capacity building of the umbrella bodies, practical, locally driven and locally specific responses. I think this is the real strength and the real need. The Pacific is very diverse. There can't be magic solutions that are going to roll out everywhere and solve everyone's needs. There needs to be local, specific solutions that are, and farmer organizations are well placed to do that. Farmers need a voice at the table. When you look at that last diagram, they don't have a voice. And again, PFON's working really hard on that, on trying to get the FOs more up there. But there's so much dialogue. There's so many things that happen behind closed doors, only with governments, only with donor governments, that there's a huge amount of work to be done there. Mostly they need resourcing, they need finance, to deliver these services, and particularly to reach the most remote and most vulnerable communities is incredibly expensive. And they need the resources to do that. They need links and partnerships across the board. Whatever we want to talk about, we're really talking about linkages. How can scientists who have some promising technology to respond to climate change, crop productivity, how can farmers validate that? How can they test that? You need the right partnerships. If there's a green climate fund, which is incredibly difficult to access and takes 10 years of negotiation, well, what are the right partnerships so that that can have the maximum impact? And then finally, just the right mix. I think there is a tendency to kind of look at this sort of magic bullet, and there are, but I think we need the right mix of scaling up and pilots and trials. There are some really promising things that the FOs in this room are ready to do. They just need resourcing, and we know that that can have really promising support to resilience of farming households. They just need the resourcing, and they can do it. And there are other things that are promising ideas, things that they may well be incredibly useful, that need to be tested and validated and then taken to scale. And we need to be clear on which one's which, and put the right resources in the right place. With that, I'll hand over to the panel. Thank you.